Picture this. A Victorian lady, perfectly poised in her drawing room, silk gown flowing, hair immaculate, the very image of refinement and elegance. Now let me tell you what nobody tells you. Beneath that 20-pound gown, no underwear, nothing, just bare skin and a split-crotch opening that left everything exposed. And when nature called, she couldn't use a toilet. There weren't any. She squatted over a porcelain pot, hidden under furniture, sometimes in the same room where guests were entertained. This wasn't poverty. This wasn't ignorance. This was every woman. Duchesses, factory workers, your great-great-grandmother. All of them. The paintings lie. The history books lie. The costume dramas lie. For the next 40 minutes, I'm going to tell you what actually happened behind those closed doors. The infections, the pain, the blood, the shame that was so deep, so crushing, that women died rather than speak about it. This is Throne of Lies, where we expose the brutal truths that history tried to bury. And I promise you, what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about the so-called good old days. Because there was nothing good about slowly destroying your body, one layer of fabric at a time. Let's begin. Let's start with the most shocking truth. Victorian women wore drawers, yes, but these weren't underwear as you know it. They were two separate legs of fabric, tied at the waist with a ribbon. And in the middle, completely open, a gap that ran from front to back, leaving everything exposed. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't poor design. This was intentional. The medical establishment of the time insisted that a woman's body needed constant air circulation. Doctors published papers claiming that closed underwear would trap moisture and heat, leading to infection, disease, and moral corruption. Yes, you heard that right. Moral corruption. In 1882, Dr. Robert Brudenell Carter wrote that sealed undergarments would cause women to become overly aware of their own bodies, leading to what he called self-pollution. The medical journals of the era are filled with warnings. Closed drawers would make women hysterical. They would damage the reproductive organs. They would cause infertility. None of this was true, but it didn't matter. What mattered was control. What mattered was keeping women's bodies exposed, vulnerable, and constantly reminded of their own inadequacy. By the 1890s, some women began wearing closed drawers. They bought them in secret. They hid them from their families. If discovered, they were mocked, shamed, called immodest. The Rational Dress Society campaigned for closed underwear and was ridiculed in newspapers across England and America. Cartoons depicted women in closed drawers as masculine, deranged, and sexually deviant. Even into the early 1900s, mothers warned their daughters that closed underwear was a sign of loose morals, that only prostitutes wore them because they needed quick access for their trade. The shame ran so deep that women's magazines refused to publish the word drawers. They called them unmentionables or that which must not be named. Imagine that. Imagine living in a world where you couldn't even speak the name of the garment you wore against your skin. And this was just the beginning. Now let's talk about what it took to get dressed every single morning. You wake up in a bedroom with no heating. It's January in London. The temperature inside your room is 32 degrees. Frost coats the inside of your windows. You sleep in a long cotton nightgown, and now you have to take it off. Completely naked in a freezing room, you reach for your chemise. This is a thin cotton shift that falls to your knees. This piece of fabric is the only thing that will stand between your skin and what comes next. The corset. Your maid, if you're wealthy enough to have one, pulls the laces. Tighter, tighter. Your ribs compress. Your lungs can't fully expand. You can take short, shallow breaths, but a deep breath? Impossible. The goal is a waist measurement of 18 to 20 inches. It doesn't matter if your natural waist is 26 inches. You will be laced until you fit the ideal. In 1887, a woman named Mary Halliday died in Chicago. The coroner's report stated that her liver had been punctured by her own ribs. The ribs had been gradually deformed by years of tight lacing, until they curved inward like claws. She was 23 years old. In 1903, doctors in Paris examined the body of a 40-year-old woman who had worn corsets since age 13. Her spine had curved into an S shape. Her lower ribs had fused together. Her stomach had been pushed upward into her chest cavity, and her intestines had been compressed into half their normal space. But Mary and that Parisian woman weren't exceptions. Autopsies from the era show that nearly every woman who wore corsets had some degree of organ displacement or bone deformation. And still, the lacing continued. After the corset comes the corset cover. Then the split-crotch drawers we already discussed, tied with a ribbon at your waist. Then stockings held up by garters that dig into your thighs. Next, the petticoats. Not one, not two. Anywhere from 3 to 6 layers of heavy cotton or wool petticoats, each weighing several pounds. Then comes the crinoline cage or the bustle. Metal hoops or wire frames that jut out from your body. You are now trapped inside a cage. If you sit, the back springs up and can hit you in the head. If you walk too quickly through a doorway, you'll get stuck. In 1863, a woman in Boston died when her crinoline cage caught fire from a parlor fireplace. She couldn't get the cage off in time. By the time her husband cut through the fabric and metal, she had third-degree burns over 60% of her body. Crinoline fires were so common that newspapers had a regular section reporting them. Hundreds of women burned to death, trapped in their own clothing. But we're not done dressing yet. After the cage comes the bodice, then the overskirt, then the outer skirt, then the jacket or day dress, then the collar pinned and buttoned, then the cuffs, then the belt. Finally, your maid fastens the dozens of tiny buttons that run up your back. Buttons you cannot reach yourself. Buttons that mean you cannot dress or undress without help. The entire process takes between 1 and 2 hours. And if you're a working-class woman, you do this alone. You wake up at 4 in the morning to give yourself enough time to get dressed before you need to start the fire, make breakfast, and get your children ready. You are already exhausted before your day even begins. Every breath is a struggle. Every movement is restricted. And you will stay in this prison of fabric and bone for the next 16 to 18 hours. This was every day. Every single day. From age 13 until death. You've been watching for nearly 12 minutes now, and you're learning what they tried to erase. While Victorian women suffered in silence, you have the power to speak up. Hit that subscribe button and help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep exposing these buried truths. These women's stories deserve to be heard. Don't let them be forgotten again. Now we need to talk about what happened when a Victorian woman needed to relieve herself. There were no toilets. Not in the way you understand them. Even in the wealthiest homes in London, Paris, and New York, indoor plumbing didn't exist for most of the 19th century. The first flushing toilets weren't installed in middle-class homes until the 1880s, and even then they were rare. So what did women do? They used chamber pots, porcelain bowls kept under the bed, hidden inside specially designed furniture, tucked into corners of rooms. In the bedroom, a chamber pot sat under the bed within arm's reach. In the drawing room, parlor, or study, pots were concealed inside elaborate wooden boxes called necessary stools. These looked like regular furniture, small tables, or cushioned seats, but inside was a removable pot. This meant that at any moment in any room of the house, someone might be using a chamber pot just feet away from you. The smell was constant, unavoidable. Perfumes and sachets were placed throughout homes not for luxury, but out of desperate necessity. But here's where it gets worse. When you're wearing a corset laced so tight you can barely breathe, 6 layers of petticoats, a crinoline cage, and a dress with dozens of buttons you cannot reach, using a chamber pot becomes a complex operation. You have to lift pounds of fabric. You have to balance over the pot while trying not to let your dress touch the floor or the pot itself. You have to do this while your lungs are compressed and you're already lightheaded. And if you're at a public event, an opera, a ball, a theater performance, a church service that lasts 3 hours, there are no facilities. None. Women had 2 choices. Hold it for the entire event, sometimes 6 to 8 hours, or try to find a private corner, lift their skirts, and use the floor. The medical journals of the era document an epidemic of urinary tract infections among women. Doctors called it ladies' complaint. They had no idea what caused it, but we know now. Women were holding their bladders for dangerous lengths of time, leading to infections that spread to the kidneys. Kidney disease was so common among Victorian women that it was considered a normal part of aging. Women in their 30s and 40s routinely suffered from kidney failure. Many died from it, but they never connected it to the fact that women had nowhere to urinate. In wealthy households, emptying and cleaning chamber pots was a servant's job, usually the lowest-ranking maid. She would carry pots full of waste down multiple flights of stairs, trying not to spill, trying not to be seen by family members or guests. If she spilled, if she was caught carrying a pot through the hallway when the master of the house appeared, she could be fired on the spot. The contents were dumped into a larger container in the basement or backyard, where night soil collectors would come after dark to haul it away in carts. They dumped it into rivers, onto fields, into massive cesspits that leaked into groundwater. This is why cholera and typhoid ravaged Victorian cities. The waste of millions of people dumped into the same water they drank. For working-class women and the poor, there were no chamber pots in every room. Often, a single pot was shared by an entire family. 10 people, 1 pot. And in tenement buildings, 30 families might share a single outhouse in the courtyard. No doors, no privacy, just wooden benches with holes, and a pit below that was emptied once a month if you were lucky. Women were assaulted in these outhouses, attacked in the dark on their way there. Many refused to go at night, holding their bladders until sunrise. The shame surrounding all of this was so extreme that women died rather than ask for help. In 1876, a woman in Philadelphia suffered a ruptured bladder at a dinner party. She had been holding her urine for over 7 hours. She collapsed at the table but told the doctor nothing was wrong. She died 3 days later from internal bleeding and infection. The medical report noted that she never once mentioned needing to use the toilet. She would rather die than admit to such an indelicate need. Chamber pot accidents were common but never discussed in polite society. A pot tips over in the night, soaking the carpet and floorboards. A maid drops one on the stairs, and the contents splash across the walls. A woman misjudges in the dark and misses the pot entirely. These incidents were sources of profound humiliation. Women who experienced them often fell into depression, unable to speak about what happened, carrying the shame in silence. This was daily life, not for the desperately poor, not for criminals or the insane, for everyone. Your great-great-grandmother lived like this, and nobody talks about it. If you think the chamber pot situation was as bad as it could get, I need you to understand something. There was one bodily function that was so unspeakable, so absolutely forbidden to discuss, that women went to their graves never having said the word aloud. Menstruation. In Victorian society, this was not just private. It was completely erased from existence. No mother told her daughter what to expect. No doctor discussed it with patients. No woman spoke of it to her husband, even after decades of marriage. Girls got their first period with no warning, no preparation, and no idea what was happening to their bodies. Many believed they were dying. Some believed they had committed a sin so terrible that God was punishing them with blood. And because no one would tell them otherwise, they believed this for years. So what did women actually use during their periods? Homemade rags, strips of old cotton fabric, torn from worn-out sheets or undergarments, folded into thick pads. These were held in place by belts or pins attached to the chemise or corset. The rags shifted. They leaked. They soaked through layers of clothing. Remember, these women are wearing split-crotch drawers. There's nothing sealed or secure. Blood runs down their legs, stains their stockings, drips onto the floor. After use, the rags had to be washed. But this couldn't be done openly. A woman couldn't hang blood-stained cloths on the washing line where neighbors or family members might see them. She couldn't leave them soaking in a basin where servants or children might discover them. She had to wash them in secret in her bedroom, often in cold water because heating water required help from servants. Then she had to hide them while they dried. Under the bed, in the back of a wardrobe, rolled up in a drawer. Wet, blood-stained fabric hidden in unventilated spaces. The smell, the bacteria, the infections. During their periods, women were expected to continue all normal activities. Dinner parties, church services, factory work. There were no accommodations, no understanding, no mercy. If anyone noticed, if any evidence appeared, the shame was unbearable. Servants were fired if they left any trace of menstruation visible. A stain on bedsheets, a rag discovered in the wash, a spot of blood on the floor. Immediate termination. No references, no second chances. In 1891, a housemaid in London named Elizabeth Shaw was dismissed after her employer found a blood-stained rag in her room. She couldn't find work anywhere else. Other households had been warned. 6 months later, she was found dead in a workhouse. She was 19 years old. But the physical reality was only part of the horror. The medical establishment made it so much worse. Victorian doctors genuinely believed that menstruation was a disease. Not a natural function but a pathology. They called it the monthly illness or the curse. And they meant it literally. Medical textbooks from the era describe menstruation as the body purging toxic buildup. They believed women were poisonous during their periods. That their breath could spoil meat. That their touch could curdle milk or kill plants. This wasn't folklore. This was published medical opinion. And the treatments? Designed to stop or reduce menstruation entirely. Bloodletting was common. Doctors would drain blood from a woman's arm during her period, believing this would redirect the flow away from the uterus. Women already losing blood were having more blood deliberately removed. Mercury compounds were prescribed. Arsenic tonics. Strychnine. Opium. All of these were given to women to regulate their cycles. These poisons didn't regulate anything. They caused organ damage, neurological problems, addiction, and death. But doctors kept prescribing them because the alternative, accepting menstruation as normal, was unthinkable. Working-class women had it even worse. Factory workers couldn't leave their stations. They bled through their clothing while operating dangerous machinery for 12-hour shifts. They developed infections that went untreated because admitting the cause meant admitting they menstruated. Shop girls who worked in department stores were required to stand for their entire shift. 10 to 14 hours without sitting. While menstruating. While wearing corsets. While bleeding into rags that were shifting and leaking. Women who worked as laundresses, already handling other people's bodily fluids all day, still had to hide their own menstrual rags like contraband. Elite women had slightly better conditions. Private bedrooms. Access to more fabric for rags. Servants who could discreetly dispose of evidence. But they suffered the same shame, the same silence, the same medical abuse. And if a woman became pregnant, the nightmare continued. There was no prenatal care as we understand it. No regular checkups. Many women didn't even tell their doctors they were pregnant because discussing it required acknowledging how they became pregnant. They continued wearing corsets throughout pregnancy. Tight lacing to hide the condition for as long as possible because a visible pregnancy was considered shameful. Women were expected to withdraw from public life once they began to show. Childbirth happened at home, often with no trained medical assistance. A midwife if you were lucky, a neighbor if you weren't. And remember, there's still no indoor plumbing. No running water. No way to sterilize instruments or wash hands properly. Puerperal fever, an infection caused by bacteria entering the birth canal, killed 20% of women who gave birth in hospitals and 10% who gave birth at home. Doctors and midwives went from patient to patient without washing their hands, spreading infection and death. A woman named Mary Wollstonecraft, the famous writer and philosopher, died of puerperal fever 11 days after giving birth in 1797. The doctor who attended her had come directly from performing an autopsy. He never washed his hands. This continued throughout the entire Victorian era. In 1847, a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis proved that hand-washing prevented puerperal fever. The medical establishment rejected his findings. They were insulted by the suggestion that gentlemen doctors could have dirty hands. Women kept dying. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. And through all of this, through the bleeding and the infections and the childbirth and the death, women were not allowed to speak. Not allowed to complain. Not allowed to acknowledge that any of this was happening. Silence was mandatory. Suffering was expected. And the alternative was social death, unemployment, institutionalization, or actual death. This is what we don't talk about when we romanticize the Victorian era. This is what the costume dramas don't show you. Now let's discuss something that might be the most disturbing revelation yet. Victorian women rarely bathed. Once a month if they were fortunate. Every 2 or 3 months was more common. Some went 6 months or longer between full baths. This wasn't laziness. This wasn't lack of awareness. This was logistics and medical belief working together to create a nightmare. To take a bath in a Victorian home required an enormous amount of labor. Water had to be hauled from a well or pump, bucket by bucket. If you wanted hot water, each bucket had to be heated over a fire or stove. A single bathtub required 30 to 40 gallons. That's roughly 80 trips carrying heavy buckets, plus hours of heating time. For wealthy families, servants did this work. For everyone else, it was nearly impossible. But even when people could manage it, doctors advised against frequent bathing. Medical journals from the 1850s through the 1890s warned that bathing more than once a month would weaken the constitution, open the pores to disease, and drain vital fluids from the body. Women were specifically told that bathing during menstruation would cause the blood to flow inward, poisoning the brain. Bathing while pregnant could kill the baby. Bathing after childbirth could cause hemorrhaging. None of this was true, but it was printed in medical textbooks and repeated by doctors across Europe and America. So women didn't bathe. They used washcloths to spot clean their faces, hands, and necks. That was it. Everything else remained unwashed for weeks or months at a time. And servants? They bathed even less frequently than their employers. A housemaid might bathe twice a year. Once in spring, once in fall. The rest of the time, she worked 16-hour days, sweating through physical labor, with no opportunity to properly clean herself. The smell in Victorian homes was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, chamber pots, menstrual blood, coal smoke, food spoilage, all of it trapped inside poorly ventilated rooms with heavy curtains and closed windows. This is why Victorians were obsessed with perfumes, sachets, and scented powders. Not as luxury items, but as desperate attempts to mask the stench of their own bodies. Women applied powder to their skin every day. Talcum powder, rice powder, chalk powder. They dusted it over their faces, necks, and chests, layering it onto skin that hadn't been washed in weeks. The powder mixed with sweat and oil, creating a thick paste that clogged pores and bred bacteria. Skin diseases were rampant. Boils, abscesses, rashes, fungal infections. These were so common they were barely remarked upon. Women simply lived with painful, oozing sores on their bodies. And their hair? Washed even less frequently than their bodies. Most women washed their hair 3 or 4 times a year. Some once a year. Hair that reached their waists thick and heavy, worn up in elaborate styles, almost never properly cleaned. The scalp became a breeding ground. Lice were universal. Every woman had them. Wealthy women, poor women, it made no difference. Nits were picked out daily by servants or family members, but new ones appeared just as fast. Seborrheic dermatitis, a condition causing scaly, itchy patches on the scalp, affected the majority of Victorian women. The smell of infected scalp tissue mixed with old hair oils and pomades was so common that people stopped noticing it. Women used dry shampoo powders, essentially cornstarch or flour, brushed through their hair to absorb oil. This provided some relief but did nothing to actually clean. The powder attracted more insects and bacteria. But the real horror was what women put on their faces in the name of beauty. The Victorian beauty standard required pale, white skin. Not just light, but ghostly white. To achieve this, women applied lead-based face paints and powders. Lead, the same substance we now know causes brain damage, kidney failure, and death. Ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, was the most popular cosmetic. Women smoothed it over their faces in thick layers. They reapplied it daily because it would crack and flake off. They never fully removed the previous layer, so lead accumulated in their skin, absorbing into their bloodstream. The symptoms of lead poisoning were well documented. Tremors, paralysis, blindness, insanity. Women developed these symptoms and kept applying the makeup anyway because the alternative was being seen with imperfect skin. In 1860, a woman named Maria Gunning, a famous Irish beauty, died at age 27. The autopsy revealed catastrophic organ failure caused by lead poisoning from her makeup. Her death was widely reported. Women read about it and continued using the same products. Arsenic was also popular. Arsenic wafers, sold as complexion pills, promised to clear the skin from the inside out. Women took them daily. They developed arsenic poisoning, vomiting, hair loss, and neurological damage, but the pills were considered essential for beauty. Belladonna drops were placed in the eyes to dilate the pupils, creating a wide-eyed, doll-like appearance. Belladonna is a deadly poison. It caused blurred vision, light sensitivity, and eventually blindness. Women used it anyway. Mercury was applied to remove freckles and blemishes. It burned the skin, creating open sores that then became infected. The infections left scars worse than the original freckles. So women applied more mercury to cover the scars. And their teeth? Rotting out of their heads. Sugar consumption increased dramatically during the Victorian era. Refined sugar in tea, cakes, candies, and desserts became affordable for the middle class. People ate sugar constantly. There was no fluoride, no modern toothpaste. Tooth powder made from chalk and soap was available, but many people never used it. Toothbrushes existed but were expensive and rarely replaced. By age 30, most people had significant tooth decay. By 40, many had lost half their teeth. Dental abscesses were common, causing facial swelling and chronic pain. The only treatment was extraction, done without anesthesia. Women smiled with blackened stumps or missing teeth. This was normal, expected. Photographs from the era show almost no one smiling with an open mouth because their teeth were too damaged to display. The smell of rot, both dental and bodily, was so pervasive that it became invisible. People genuinely stopped registering it because everyone smelled the same. But we register it now. We understand now what they lived with. The constant discomfort, the infections, the poisoning, the decay. And still, we look at their photographs and their paintings and we think they lived in elegance. They lived in filth. Decorated, perfumed, powdered filth. But filth nonetheless. By now, you might be wondering how doctors responded to all of this suffering. Surely they saw what was happening to women's bodies. Surely they connected the corsets, the lack of sanitation, the toxic cosmetics to the epidemic of illness. They did see it. And they blamed the women. Every physical symptom, every complaint, every medical crisis was attributed to one diagnosis: female hysteria. Hysteria wasn't a disease. It was a convenient label doctors applied to any woman whose suffering they didn't want to address. And it covered everything. A woman faints repeatedly throughout the day? Hysteria. Never mind that her corset has compressed her lungs so severely she can't get enough oxygen to her brain. A woman complains of chronic abdominal pain? Hysteria. Ignore the fact that her intestines have been crushed into half their normal space and she hasn't had a proper bowel movement in weeks. Chronic constipation was nearly universal among Victorian women. The combination of compressed organs and restrictive clothing made normal digestion impossible. Women went days, sometimes weeks, without being able to relieve themselves. The pain was excruciating. The bloating made the corset even tighter, which made the constipation worse. Doctors prescribed laxatives that caused violent cramping. When that didn't work, they performed manual disimpaction, a horrifying procedure done without anesthesia. And when women continued to suffer, they were told it was all in their heads. But the physical damage went far beyond constipation. Prolapsed organs were epidemic. The uterus, bladder, and rectum, weakened by multiple pregnancies and constant pressure from corsets, would collapse downward. Women could feel their own organs bulging out of their bodies. This condition was agonizing. Walking became difficult. Sitting was torture. And there was no real treatment. Doctors prescribed bed rest, which only weakened the muscles further. Some inserted pessaries, devices meant to hold the organs in place, but these often caused infections and made the problem worse. Medical records from the 1880s show that over 40% of women who sought medical care had some degree of uterine prolapse. 40%. This wasn't rare. This was the norm. And it wasn't just the uterus. Bladder prolapse caused constant urinary leakage. Women lived with urine-soaked rags pressed against their bodies, unable to control their own bladders, ashamed to tell anyone. Respiratory problems were just as common. Decades of compressed lungs left women unable to breathe properly even when the corset came off. Chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and tuberculosis rates were significantly higher in women than men. Doctors never questioned why. The spine told its own horror story. X-rays taken in the early 1900s, when the technology became available, revealed the damage. Women's spines curved unnaturally. Vertebrae were compressed. Ribs had grown inward. Some women's rib cages had been permanently deformed into shapes that mimicked the corset even when they weren't wearing it. A study conducted in 1908 examined 100 women over the age of 50 who had worn corsets their entire lives. 93 of them had spinal deformities. 78 had chronic back pain. 62 had visible rib deformities. The study concluded that corsets might be harmful and suggested women consider looser lacing. That was it. No calls to ban them. No public health campaigns. Just a polite suggestion that maybe crushing women's bones wasn't ideal. Varicose veins and circulation problems were also rampant. Tight garters cutting into thighs, combined with hours of standing in restrictive clothing, caused blood to pool in the legs. Veins bulged and twisted under the skin. Ulcers formed. Some women developed blood clots that traveled to their lungs and killed them. But when a woman went to her doctor complaining of leg pain, swelling, and difficulty walking, what did he diagnose? Hysteria. Infections from unsanitary menstrual practices caused chronic pelvic inflammatory disease. Women developed fevers, abdominal pain, and infertility. The infection would spread through their reproductive organs, causing abscesses and scarring. Left untreated, it killed them. Doctors never asked about menstruation. The topic was too indelicate. So they diagnosed hysteria and sent women home to suffer. The treatments for hysteria were as brutal as they were useless. Bloodletting, ice baths, enforced bed rest for months at a time. Women were isolated from their families, forbidden to read or write, fed only milk and bland food. The rest cure was supposed to calm their nerves. Instead, it drove many women to actual insanity. And then there was the vibrator. Yes, that vibrator. It was invented as a medical device to treat hysteria. Doctors genuinely believed that women's suffering was caused by sexual frustration, and that inducing orgasm would cure them. This happened in medical offices. Women paid for this treatment. Doctors performed it clinically, with no acknowledgement of what was actually happening. It was called pelvic massage, and was one of the most common medical procedures of the late Victorian era. The vibrator was invented in 1883 because doctors' hands were getting tired. They needed a more efficient way to perform the procedure multiple times a day. Let that sink in. Women were in agony from organ damage, infections, and malnutrition. And the medical solution was to give them orgasms and send them home. The real causes were dismissed. The symptoms were treated as mental illness. And women continued to suffer and die from conditions that were entirely preventable. In 1895, a doctor named Robert Batty began performing oophorectomies, the surgical removal of healthy ovaries, to cure hysteria. He believed that removing a woman's ovaries would calm her nerves and make her more manageable. Hundreds of women underwent this surgery. They were mutilated and left infertile, all because doctors refused to acknowledge that their suffering had physical causes. Some women died on the operating table. Others died from infections afterward. The ones who survived lived with the hormonal devastation of surgical menopause, which doctors also refused to treat properly. This wasn't ancient history. This was happening while the telephone was being invented, while electric lights were being installed in homes, while the modern world was being built, and women were being butchered in the name of medicine. We're halfway through exposing what they tried to hide for centuries. If you're shocked by what you've learned, imagine what we'll uncover next. Hit subscribe and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. These stories need amplification. Every subscription is a vote against historical erasure. Don't let them bury this again. We've talked about menstruation. We've talked about the daily torture of simply existing in a Victorian woman's body. Now we need to discuss what happened when that body became pregnant. Pregnancy was not celebrated. It was shameful. A visible pregnancy meant everyone knew you had engaged in sexual intercourse, and that knowledge was considered deeply improper. So women hid it. They continued wearing their corsets, laced as tightly as their changing bodies would allow. Some women wore corsets through their entire pregnancy, only loosening them slightly in the final weeks. The pressure on the developing fetus was catastrophic. Miscarriages were common. Premature births were common. Babies born with deformities or developmental problems were common. But no one connected it to the corsets because no one was allowed to discuss pregnancy openly enough to gather data. Women were expected to work until the moment labor began. There was no maternity leave. No reduced duties. No accommodation of any kind. A factory worker would stand at her station, 9 months pregnant, operating machinery for 12 hours. A domestic servant would scrub floors, carry heavy loads, and climb stairs until her water broke. A farm wife would milk cows, haul water, and cook for field hands right up until contractions made it impossible to stand. When labor finally started, there was no hospital, no medical team, no sterilized equipment. Birth happened at home, in the same bed where the woman slept, often in the same room where the family lived, ate, and worked. If she was wealthy, a doctor might attend. If she was middle class, perhaps a midwife. If she was poor, maybe a neighbor who had given birth before, or maybe no one at all. And there was no pain relief. Anesthesia existed. Chloroform had been used successfully during surgery since the 1840s. Queen Victoria herself used chloroform during the birth of her 8th child in 1853. But for most women, pain relief was considered improper, morally wrong, against God's will. Religious leaders preached that the pain of childbirth was divine punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. Women were meant to suffer. To ask for relief was to reject God's judgment. Medical journals debated whether women even needed pain relief. Some doctors argued that the pain served a necessary purpose, that it helped women bond with their babies or stimulated proper labor. Others simply believed women were exaggerating their suffering for attention. So women gave birth in agony, screaming, begging, sometimes biting through leather straps or pieces of wood placed in their mouths. Labor could last for days, 48 hours, 72 hours. Some women labored for over a week before either delivering or dying. And when complications occurred, there was almost nothing that could be done. If the baby was positioned wrong, if the pelvis was too narrow, if the labor simply wouldn't progress, women died. Slowly, painfully, fully conscious as their bodies tore apart from the inside. Doctors had forceps, but using them often caused more damage than help. Babies were pulled out with such force that their skulls fractured or their necks broke. Women's pelvic bones cracked. Their tissue ripped so severely that they were left with permanent injuries. Obstetric fistulas, tears between the vaginal wall and bladder or rectum, left women leaking urine and feces for the rest of their lives. There was no surgical repair available for most of the Victorian era. Women just lived with it, constantly wet, constantly soiled, unable to control their own bodies. And if the woman survived the birth itself, she faced an even greater danger. Puerperal fever. This infection killed more women than any other childbirth complication. It was caused by bacteria introduced during delivery by unwashed hands, unsterilized instruments, or contaminated bedding. Doctors in the Victorian era understood almost nothing about germ theory. They went from patient to patient, from autopsy room to delivery room, without washing their hands. They believed they were too educated, too gentlemanly to carry disease. When Ignaz Semmelweis proved in 1847 that hand-washing prevented puerperal fever, the medical establishment destroyed him. They rejected his findings. They mocked him publicly. He died in an asylum, beaten by guards, his theories dismissed. And women kept dying. 1 in 5 hospital births resulted in puerperal fever. 1 in 10 home births. The fever would start within days of delivery. High temperature, chills, abdominal pain, then delirium, then death. It was so common that women wrote goodbye letters to their children before going into labor. They made arrangements for who would raise their children after they died. They accepted death as a likely outcome. And even if a woman survived, her body was destroyed. Victorian women typically had 10 or more pregnancies. Some had 15, 20. Each pregnancy weakened the body further. Bones lost calcium. Teeth fell out. Organs prolapsed. Anemia became severe. Malnutrition was universal. Women in their 30s looked like they were in their 50s. Women in their 40s looked ancient. The strain of constant pregnancy and inadequate recovery time aged them decades beyond their years. Infant mortality was also staggering. 1 in 4 children died before their first birthday. 1 in 3 died before age 5. Mothers expected to lose children. They prepared for it emotionally because the alternative was to be destroyed by grief over and over again. Some women gave birth to 12 children and watched 8 of them die. The causes were preventable. Contaminated water, lack of sanitation, malnutrition, infectious diseases that spread rapidly through crowded homes. But prevention required acknowledging that these problems existed, and Victorian society refused. After giving birth, there was no recovery period. Working-class women were back on their feet within days, sometimes within hours. They had no choice. There was no one else to do the work. They cooked, they cleaned, they hauled water, they cared for other children, all while bleeding heavily, while their bodies tried to heal from trauma, while fighting off infection. And they were expected to breastfeed, exclusively, for a year or more. But remember, they're corseted again within weeks of giving birth. The corset compresses the ribcage and abdomen, making it difficult to breathe deeply. This reduces milk supply. The baby doesn't get enough nutrition. The mother's body, already depleted, is further drained. Many women couldn't produce enough milk. Their babies starved slowly, becoming weak and susceptible to disease. The mothers watched their children waste away and blamed themselves, never understanding that their clothing was strangling their ability to feed their own infants. Wet nurses were available for wealthy families, but this came with its own horrors. Wet nurses were usually poor women who had recently given birth. They were paid to nurse someone else's baby while their own baby was fed cheap substitutes or simply neglected. The mortality rate for wet nurses' biological children was catastrophic. They died while their mothers fed and saved the children of the rich. This was the cycle. Pregnancy, torture, birth, possible death, recovery measured in days not weeks, immediate return to brutal labor, and then pregnancy again. Over and over until menopause or death, whichever came first. One Victorian woman's diary, published anonymously in 1892, describes her experience. She had 13 pregnancies, 7 live births, 6 miscarriages. 3 of her children died in infancy. She developed a prolapsed uterus after her 4th birth and lived with it for 20 years. She wrote that she couldn't remember a single month of her adult life when her body didn't hurt. She died at age 41. The cause of death listed on her certificate was exhaustion. That's what it came down to. Women's bodies simply gave out. Used up. Worn down. Exhausted to death. And this was considered normal. Natural. The price of being a woman. You might be thinking that surely the wealthy women had it better. That money could buy comfort, safety, escape from the worst of what we've described. Couldn't. Class determined many things in Victorian society, but it could not protect women from their own biology. It could not eliminate the torture of corsets, the horror of menstruation, or the danger of childbirth. Money bought privacy. It bought servants to empty your chamber pot. It bought doctors who would come to your home. But it couldn't buy freedom from the fundamental nightmare of living in a female body during the Victorian era. Let's start with the women who had nothing. Factory workers stood at their stations for 12 to 14 hours without breaks. There were no bathrooms, no places to sit, no accommodation for menstruation or illness. Women urinated on themselves at their machines because leaving their post meant losing wages or being fired. They bled through their clothing and kept working because they had no choice. The factories were hot, poorly ventilated, filled with cotton dust or chemical fumes. Women fainted from heat exhaustion, from corsets restricting their breathing, from sheer exhaustion. When they collapsed, they were dragged outside, revived with cold water and sent back to work. In textile mills, women's long skirts and hair got caught in machinery. The accidents were horrific. Scalping, limbs torn off, bodies pulled into gears and crushed. In 1900, there were over 30,000 recorded factory accidents involving women in England alone. The real number was certainly higher because many injuries went unreported. Domestic servants had their own particular hell. They worked 18 to 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. They wore full Victorian dress while scrubbing floors, hauling coal, emptying chamber pots, and carrying buckets of water up multiple flights of stairs. They slept in unheated attic rooms or damp basements. They ate the cheapest food, usually whatever was left over from the family's meals. They bathed almost never because they had no time and no privacy. And they were completely at the mercy of their employers. Sexual abuse was rampant. If a servant became pregnant, she was fired immediately with no references. She couldn't get another position. Many ended up in workhouses or on the streets. Which brings us to prostitution. The mortality rate for prostitutes in Victorian London was the highest of any occupation. Higher than coal miners. Higher than soldiers in active combat. They died from violence, from disease, from botched abortions, from exposure in winter. The average life expectancy of a woman who entered prostitution was 4 years. 4 years from the first transaction to death. They had no access to medical care. Venereal diseases were epidemic. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections destroyed their bodies slowly. They developed open sores, went blind, lost their minds as the diseases attacked their brains. And when they could no longer work, when they were too sick or too damaged, they were thrown out onto the streets to die. No hospitals would take them. No charities would help them. They died in alleys, in doorways, alone. Middle-class women had different suffering but equal in its own way. They were trapped in their homes, expected to maintain households, raise children, and present perfect domestic tranquility, while managing all the physical horrors we've already discussed. They had no independent income, no legal rights. Their property belonged to their husbands. They couldn't divorce except under the most extreme circumstances. If their husband was abusive, if he spent all their money, if he infected them with venereal disease from his own affairs, they had no recourse. They were socially isolated, expected to stay home unless chaperoned, forbidden from most public spaces without male escort. Their entire world was constrained to a house they didn't own, filled with children they couldn't stop having, wearing clothes that slowly destroyed their bodies. And the elite women, the ones we see in paintings and photographs, dripping in jewels and expensive gowns, they suffered all the same biological nightmares. They wore tighter corsets because fashion demanded it. They used more toxic makeup because pale skin was a status symbol. They had more pregnancies because producing heirs was their primary function. They had better doctors, but those doctors were often more dangerous than helpful. They had more servants, but that meant less physical labor, which led to weaker bodies that couldn't handle the strain of pregnancy and corset wearing as well. Elite women died in childbirth at nearly the same rate as working-class women. They developed the same infections, the same organ prolapses, the same respiratory problems. Princess Charlotte, the only child of the future King George IV, died in childbirth in 1817 at age 21. She had access to the best medical care in the world. It didn't matter. She labored for over 50 hours. Her baby was stillborn. She hemorrhaged and died 6 hours later. The daughter of the wealthiest, most powerful family in England couldn't be saved. That's what class meant in Victorian society when it came to women's bodies. It meant nothing. Rich women had their chamber pots emptied by servants, but they still squatted over chamber pots. They had servants to lace their corsets, but the corsets still crushed their organs. They had private rooms to deal with menstruation, but they still bled into homemade rags and suffered the shame in silence. The great equalizer was biology. Every woman menstruated. Every woman's body was corseted. Every woman faced the danger of pregnancy. Every woman lived with the constant threat of infection and death from basic bodily functions. The class differences were in degree, not in kind. A working-class woman might empty her own chamber pot while an elite woman had a servant do it. But they both used chamber pots. They both dealt with the smell, the accidents, the health consequences. A factory worker fainted from her corset while standing at a machine. An aristocrat fainted from her corset while sitting in a drawing room. The location changed. The suffering didn't. No woman escaped. Not one. Whether you lived in a mansion or a tenement, whether you had 12 servants or were the servant, your body was subjected to the same fundamental tortures. Victorian society was built on the subjugation of women's bodies. It required women to suffer in silence, to pretend everything was fine, to maintain appearances while slowly being destroyed from the inside out. And every class participated. The wealthy didn't save themselves. They just suffered with better furniture around them. So how did it end? How did women finally escape this nightmare? They fought. For decades, they fought against a system designed to keep them silent and suffering. The reform movements began in the 1850s. Women activists started questioning everything. The corsets, the layers of clothing, the medical establishment's control over their bodies. In 1851, Amelia Bloomer introduced loose trousers worn under a shorter skirt. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Women who wore bloomers were attacked in the streets. Newspapers published cartoons depicting them as monsters and degenerates. Doctors warned that wearing trousers would damage women's reproductive organs and turn them into men. The Rational Dress Society formed in London in 1881. Their demands were modest. They wanted clothing that weighed less than 7 pounds. They wanted undergarments that didn't restrict breathing. They wanted fabric that could be washed. The medical establishment fought them every step. Doctors published papers claiming that abandoning the corset would cause women's organs to collapse. That their spines would crumble without the support. That their bodies would become so weak they couldn't bear children. None of this was true, but it was printed in medical journals and newspapers. The propaganda was relentless. Women who adopted rational dress were fired from jobs, rejected by their families, labeled as radicals and troublemakers. Some were institutionalized, declared insane for refusing to wear proper clothing. The change came slowly, painfully slowly. By the 1890s, some women were wearing slightly looser corsets. By 1900, split-crotch drawers were beginning to be replaced by closed underwear, though many women still resisted. And then came World War I. When millions of men left for the front, women had to take their places. In factories, in fields, in offices and hospitals. They couldn't do this work in corsets and 20 pounds of fabric. Necessity forced what decades of activism couldn't. Women began wearing practical clothing, shorter skirts, no corsets, closed underwear, comfortable shoes. They cut their hair because it was easier to manage. They stopped using toxic makeup because they didn't have time. They discovered that their bodies could move, could breathe, could function without being trapped in cages of fabric and bone. And when the war ended, they refused to go back. The 1920s brought the flapper dress. Straight, loose, ending at the knee. No corset required. No petticoats. No cage. For the first time in over a century, women could breathe fully. They could move freely. They could use a toilet without an elaborate production. Indoor plumbing became standard in middle-class homes. Bathrooms with real toilets and sinks. Running water. The chamber pot nightmare finally ended. Menstrual products began to be manufactured and sold commercially. Disposable pads appeared in the 1920s. Women no longer had to wash and hide blood-stained rags. Medical understanding improved. Slowly, doctors began to accept that menstruation was normal. That women's health complaints had physical causes. That maybe, just maybe, crushing women's organs was harmful. But the damage had been done. Generations of women had their bodies destroyed. Millions died. Millions more lived in agony. And then something else happened. The history was sanitized. By the 1950s, the Victorian era was being romanticized. Movies and books depicted it as a time of elegance and refinement. The suffering was erased. The horror was buried. People didn't want to remember what their grandmothers had endured. It was too ugly, too uncomfortable, too revealing about what society had been willing to do to women. So they rewrote it. They focused on the pretty dresses and the grand houses and the romantic courtships. They left out the blood and the infection and the death. Today, we have costume dramas that show corseted women gliding through ballrooms. We have historical romance novels where heroines wear beautiful gowns and never mention menstruation or chamber pots. We have a collective amnesia about what life actually was. The effects lasted for generations. Women born in the 1920s and 1930s were raised by mothers and grandmothers who had lived through the Victorian nightmare. Those older women passed down shame about bodies, about menstruation, about sex and pregnancy. They taught their daughters that women's pain didn't matter. That suffering was expected. That you didn't complain, you didn't ask for help, you just endured. This mentality shaped medical care for women throughout the 20th century. Doctors dismissing women's pain, assuming women were exaggerating, treating women's health issues as psychological rather than physical. Even now, in 2025, women's pain is taken less seriously than men's. Women wait longer in emergency rooms. Women's heart attacks are misdiagnosed. Women's chronic conditions are dismissed as stress or anxiety. The Victorian legacy lives on. You've spent 40 minutes learning what took these women lifetimes of suffering. The algorithm buries content like this because it's uncomfortable, because it challenges the sanitized version of history we're supposed to accept. Help us fight it. Subscribe now and be part of the 1,000 who refuse to let history lie. Share this video. Every woman's daughter deserves to know what her great-great-grandmother endured. The truth is ugly, but silence is uglier. Join Throne of Lies in exposing what the history books won't tell you. Here's your final statistic. Between 1837 and 1901, Queen Victoria's entire reign, approximately 5 million women died in childbirth in England alone. 5 million. That's one woman every 3 minutes, dying in agony for 64 years. And nobody talks about it. Until now.